สวัสดีค่ะ สวัสดีค่ะ everybody. Welcome to the Siam Society. It is... everybody's here. Okay, right. Actually, on behalf of the council member, I would like to welcome you all, especially Kun Simon Landy, the speaker of our talk tonight. So let me introduce him because I have known him for many, many years. I think 30 years ago. At that time, we were building Sathorn Thani, which is the first high-rise on Sathorn Road. And there I met Kun Simon, who was head of research for Richard Ellis. Later on, Kun Simon became head of Jardine Colliers, of course, for many years. And he is the best property advisor in Bangkok. And he was also the chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce here in Thailand. So it's not surprising that he started the book with a handshake with Boris Johnson, I think. Okay. As a top-notch property investment consultant, he knows everybody in real estate, which means he knows everybody in Thailand who owns what and where. He knows Bangkok like the back of his hand, even better than 90% of the Thai ourselves. From the book, I learned where Prince Wongsathirajanit lived during the reign of King Rama IV, and it's the first time. I think as a historian, that's shameful not to know. After his retirement, he went back to London and head to the British Library and to research on the topic that is close to his heart. And it's an outcome of this really interesting and intriguing book, which we've never seen for many years. And it is the first time that here at the Siam Society for a book launch that was booked on the 4th floor lecture room, overflow to the main auditorium full. So that is to his credit. As I was reading this wonderful book, it became obvious to me that Kun Simon seemed to know the Thai psyche very well. In fact, better than me. You know, what he wrote of the Galahome or King Rama IV is very insightful. And moreover, it sort of gives you an understanding of what Thailand property law and history during that period is about. Very clear understanding. So without further ado, I would like to invite Kun Simon here to give you this wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Pimprapai, for that glowing introduction. I don't know how to follow that, actually, but I'll try. Kun Pimprapai very kindly, is this microphone working okay? Did my job for me and explained quite a bit of my background, but I'll just elaborate on that a little bit before I talk about the book and some background to the book. As Kun Pimprapai was saying, I was involved in the property as a property consultant in Thailand for 30 years before I retired. So I'm not a professional historian. But in my final days in that world, I came across a story that I thought was fascinating. And it all had to do with the sale of the British Embassy. Now, those of you who are familiar with this story, apologies, you're about to hear it again. But I think a lot of people are not that familiar. But what happened was that the British government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that they would sell a historic property that had been the home of the British Embassy for almost 100 years. And this caused a great deal of controversy, not only in the British community, but also in the Thai community. Because from one point of view, it looked like the British were kind of downgrading relations, which wasn't the case, but that was the impression it gave. But it also symbolized, that building symbolized soft power, and it was a wonderful facility that the governments had used for entertaining and for business. And so by selling it represented a decline in soft power. Now, Boris Johnson comes into this story at this point. I was on the board of the British Chamber, as Kumpin Prapai mentioned, and because of my background in property, a lot of people were coming to me and saying, surely you can stop this awful event happening, this sale shouldn't go ahead, and you need to do something about it. I couldn't do anything about it, of course, but what I could do was collar Boris Johnson, who visited Thailand in February 2018, just as this deal was being finalized. And there was a reception at the very British Embassy that we're talking about, and I did get a chance to ask him a question about the fate of the British Embassy. And I would say it was his almost total lack of concern that inspired me to dig deeper into this story. Because what a lot of people here believed was that the sale of the embassy could have been an invalid transaction, because many people believed the embassy had been donated or given or granted to the British government by the King of Thailand, in which case it would be either illegal, immoral, invalid, whatever, to then sell it on for commercial purposes. So that's the story I got hooked on in a way. This is the embassy. The building in the middle was the ambassador's residence, which was built in 1926. The statue of Queen Victoria was even older, dating from 1905, and the War Memorial was post-First World War, so about 1921. What I found when I looked into this story was, in fact, that the sale or the purchase of the embassy property was a real transaction. It was not donated by the king. However, even though that hadn't happened, there was another story behind this story, which concerned the original site of the British Consulate in Siam, which was on the river and had been established in the 1850s. And that story was just so fascinating that I felt a book had to be written about it. And that's why we came to this book. So I want to explain a little bit about the background of Siam at that time, very briefly, because I know a lot of you will actually know a lot more about it than I will. But I need to set some context. This is a map of Southeast Asia today. So you can see ASEAN, as we call it, is 10 independent countries, each one with its own government, different political systems, different economic systems, but each independent. If we go back to just before the First World War, there was only one independent country in what is today ASEAN. The British were on the mainland, the French were in Indochina, the Dutch were in Indonesia, and the Philippines was under America. Siam was the only independent country, This is, as I'm sure you all know, a great source of national pride in Thailand, and not without reason. In the period of my book, which was the 1850s, that situation, the colonization, was only just beginning. And the British were in the southern part of Burma, the French were just beginning to make inroads into Indochina, and the British were in Malaya. But Thailand was not really threatened directly at that time, or not on a consistent basis. A lot of the success of Thailand's ability to avoid colonization is attributed to its two great 19th century kings, King Rama IV, King Mongkut, and King Rama V, his son, King Chulalongkorn. And what I think stood them apart, what made King Mongkut such an effective bulwark against colonization, was that unlike in Vietnam or in China even, or Burma of course, he kind of understood that what the British really wanted was trade, not territory. If they couldn't get their trade, they'd take the territory. But if they could be given trade, they wouldn't necessarily want or need the territory. And I think that realization was fundamental to his and his son's success in avoiding the colonial trap. In the 1850s, Bangkok was very different from what it is today. This is a typical Bangkok scene from the 1860s, actually. Very rural, no roads, not a single road, except, well, the first road was actually 1862. So in the 1850s, the only roads were in the Grand Palace itself, or in the Chinese Bazaar. But this was a much more typical scene. This would be the central business district of Bangkok in the 1850s. Most of the houses here on the left are actually built on the water, floating houses. And of course, a typical market scene on the right. This photo is taken by John Thomson in 1864. It's a view of Bangkok from Wat Arun on the river, looking across to the Bangkok side from Thonburi. Today looks a bit more like this. I mean, just the skyline has changed so fundamentally. And here we have the Golden Mount in the 1860s, and the Golden Mount today, from in the middle of almost like a moated community to being in the middle of a urban megalopolis. The population of Bangkok at that period was, nobody really knows, but is generally considered to be under 100,000. And about half would have been Chinese. 30,000 roughly Siamese, and the rest a mixture of Lao, Khmer, Mon, Cochin Chinese, Cambodian. And these people have either moved in or more often been captured in war and brought in, or in the case of the Chinese, mostly come in as merchants. You see the number at the bottom there. It may be a bit difficult to read the description, but 50 is my estimate of the number of Westerners in Bangkok in 1850. So about a third of the Westerners in this room would be the total Western population of Bangkok in the 1850s, and half of those were missionaries. This is what people look like in perfectly natural poses. And of course, the temple art reflected not only Chinese presence, but also Western presence. But there were Westerners, and here's a selection of some of the more well-known Westerners at the time. The Bradley family and the Mattoon family were both Protestant missionaries and Palgois was the senior French missionary. On the right are a number of ambassadors. So in the 1850s, the king was King Mongkut. Now, unfortunately, King Mongkut has suffered a great deal in the West from his portrayal in The King and I, the all-singing, all-dancing Yul Brynner that we became familiar with. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, King Mongkut was a deeply religious, very austere man. He spent 27 years as a monk in the monastery before he became king. So when he became king, he made up for lost time and had 82 children. But he was regarded as one of the great kings of Thailand. As I've said, his realization of the motivation of the British stood Siam in very good stead. The year of his coronation was May, well, it was 1851. His coronation was in May. 2 weeks before that event was the opening of the Great Exhibition in London. Some of you may be familiar with this. This was in Hyde Park. They built Prince Albert's great monument to the British Empire and industrial progress in the West. And I put this picture up here because in a sense these two monarchs represent polar opposites, or appear to. Queen Victoria, the head of an ever-expanding, forward-looking, progressive, industrializing empire, and King Mongkut, the head of a rather insular country that he himself considered rather backward, steeped in traditions, and just, if you like, polar opposites. But because he realized the need to make friends with the West and to come to terms with the West, he actively invited the British under Sir John Bowring, who was the Governor General of Hong Kong, to come to Bangkok and negotiate a trade treaty, which he did. Bowring turns up in 1855, just 4 years into the reign, with his secretary, Harry Parkes, and the king, King Mongkut, sets up a commission of senior Siamese people to negotiate with the Brits. And these are the people on the commission. You see in the middle, Prince Wongsa, whose house Kun Piprapai has just discovered, who lived on the river, of course. And he was the only royal in this group of negotiators. All the other four are from the Bunag family. 2 generations, the elder Bunags on the right, the younger Bunags on the left. The younger Bunags were all for reform and free trade, or opening up to trade, maybe not free. The elder Bunags were more reactionary, wanted things to stay. They were making tons of money as things were, didn't really want things to change. The prince sided with the reformers. So in the end, we get the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce, signed in April 1855, ratified a year later. And that is remains the basis of Anglo-Siam relations for almost 100 years. Now, when people talk about this treaty, and it's often called the Bowring Treaty, the main thing people focus on is the trade. The treaty reduced import duties to 3%. It opened up a whole bunch of commodities to trade, and that was its main purpose from the British point of view. It also incorporated a second element that a lot of people focus on as well, which is called the extraterritorial provisions. And these provisions were exactly the same as those that had been imposed on on the treaty ports in China after the Opium War. And they allowed British people, British subjects in Siam to be tried. If they did something wrong, they could be tried by the British consul, not by the Siamese courts. And both those things are very controversial and endless debate. But what I wanted to focus on, what I noticed in the treaty, was something that I thought hadn't really been talked about a lot, which was a third element, apart from the trade and the extraterritorial provisions. And this third element spoke to me personally because it was about property. And it was certain property provisions that had been included in the treaty. And when I looked into it, these property provisions at the time were extremely controversial. In fact, in some ways, more controversial than the trade and extraterritoriality provisions. So the reason for the property provisions was that Bowring was saying, look, for British traders to come here, they need to be able to open up a shop or build a ship or trade in the market, do stuff. And to do that, they need property, and to be secure, they need certain property rights, whether it's renting the land or building a house or buying land. And this was something that made the Siamese very nervous. And in the end, a compromise was reached. And it had two main parts to this compromise. This is a map of the Gulf of Siam. You can see Bangkok near the bottom there. What the treaty says is that, okay, if you're British and you want to come and do business in Siam, you may come and you can buy land. But you cannot buy land that is more than 24 hours traveling distance from Bangkok. Remember, there's no roads. So 24 hours traveling distance means getting on a boat and going up a river for 24 hours. And so that's why this funny shape emerged, which is essentially the length of various rivers at a certain traveling speed assumed to be. And so that was the area drawn up. Within that area, you could buy land. Outside that area, you couldn't if you were British. And the reason for that was the king said, we don't really control that area so well, so we can't really protect anyone who goes there. But the second provision was even more interesting in a way. This is a map of Bangkok. On the left, that map was actually drawn up in 1856 by a British surveying team. And it was the best map of Bangkok for many, many years. What it shows, on the right is basically just a zoom into that map. And what the provision said in the treaty said, okay, you can buy land that's less than, if it's not more than 24 hours travel distance, but if the land is within 4 miles of the Grand Palace, then you cannot buy it, but you can rent it. And that would take you down to roughly here, by river, and somewhere north of the map on the north side. So basically, all this area here, the inner city, the Siamese said, we want to keep the ownership of that because that's really valuable land. And that was agreed. So that's really the basis of where my book begins. I'm not going to tell the whole story of the book, but I'll just go through a couple of points. What happens in 1855 is the treaty is signed, not yet ratified, but signed, and a gentleman from Britain with the very Dickensian name of Captain Christopher Paddycombe turns up. Now, Captain Paddycombe had been living in India and was a master merchant, and he was sailing ships into Siam, into China, into Singapore, knew the area very well. And he also knew the king. And he said, well, now we've got this treaty, I'll come to Bangkok. And so he turns up in Bangkok in June, I think it is, with his family, of his wife and 7 children. Remember, there are only 50 Westerners in Bangkok. He's basically increased the Western population by about 30%, 20%. And of course, there are no children except a few missionary kids. Other than that, there's no Western children. And he finds this land down here. In fact, this map is done a few months after he arrived. And it even says down here, Paddycombe Dock. And that's the land that he identified to build ships. And so he identifies the land, and he hires a Chinese foreman called Ai Fung. Now remember, if it's within 4 miles, he can't buy the land, he has to rent it. But he really wants security of tenure. So he says, I'll tell you what, Ai Fung, here's the money, you go and buy the land from the current owner, and then come to me and I'll rent the land from you. Which is, okay, he can do that. And he does that. Trouble is, he does a 99-year lease. Thailand, Siam, had never seen a lease longer than 10 years. Most would be 3. 99 was pushing the boat out by quite a long way. Anyway, when the king finds out, he is furious. And so he has Ai Fung arrested, and he says, where did you get this lease? Who wrote it? And he says, well, there's a man, Nai Seng, a Thai man. He wrote the lease for me, and we signed it, and it's perfectly legal. So he arrests Nai Seng, and Nai Seng is punished, and unfortunately, he dies. Now, Paddycombe is a bit worried by this time. He thinks things may not be going exactly to plan. So he tries to lobby the British consul. He tries all kinds of things. But the problem is, and the reason is he thinks he can get away with it, is because of his relationship with the king. And I found, when I was going through the archive in London, in Kew, I found this fascinating letter. Just put it up here. This is from King Mongkut to Captain Christopher Paddycombe. And it basically says, I'm sorry that you did not require me my permission for purchasing the land previously. Are you not my old friend? Long has been my very intimate, more than 10 years. So they are actually pretty close. I mean, the king knows Paddycombe pretty well. So Paddycombe reckons he can work this situation. He was wrong. So meanwhile, the treaty with Britain has been signed, and under the treaty, the British are supposed to send a consul to Siam. Hence the name of my book, The King and the Consul. And here is that consul. His name is Charles Batten Hillier. He comes along in June 1856 with his lovely wife Eliza and their 4-year-old daughter Maud. They've come from Hong Kong. They're both old Asia hands. They're only in their 30s, but they've been in Asia a long time, in China. And in fact, Eliza was born in what is today Jakarta. Anyway, so they come along, and their job is to set up the very first British consulate in Siam. There's never been one before. So the first thing he needs to do is find a property. So again, a property angle always appeals to me. He had to find a property, and when I'll come back to that. When he arrived, this is where he was staying. It was a building called the British Factory. It's not really manufacturing, it's just for factoring, it's for trading. It's a trading establishment established in the 1820s by a Scottish trader called Robert Hunter, who some of you may have heard of. Anyway, he got in trouble and got kicked out of the country and left his factory behind. And so the Siamese said, well, you can use this, nobody's using it. And so they move in, but it's awful. They don't like it. Eliza can't stand it. So he knows he's got to move. And so he starts looking for somewhere to stay. Eventually, he hits on a place that he likes. It's on the river, British Consulate Legation, 1858 to 1926. It's right on the river. If you know Bangkok now, you know on that particular site, on the Jaron Grung Road side, is the old General Post Office, and on the riverside is the CAT Telecom Tower, which is now called the NT Telecom Tower. So he picks on that site, and he negotiates to buy it, and he thinks he's got a deal. He's agreed a price. He writes to London, says, I've got a deal, all I need is your permission, but we're good to go. But then this stuff happens with Paddycombe. The problem is not Paddycombe, the problem is Nai Seng. Remember, Nai Seng is the poor guy who wrote the lease and unfortunately died as a result of being punished. Now, Nai Seng, it turns out, was working for Hillier. He was working at the British Consulate as a translator, as a scribe. And so, technically, under the Bowring Treaty, he was a British subject, even though he was Siamese. So as a British subject, he's protected by the British, and you can't punish British subjects without the consul being present. And Hillier's quite an emotional man, you've got to say. I mean, he's not particularly well balanced, and he sort of throws a hissy fit. And it just gets worse and worse. Everybody's getting very upset. The king is not happy. His opinion of, this is from the Thai archive, his opinion of Hillier is just not very nice. He just says he's always nabun, sort of gloomy, sulky. He's always sulking. And he's always demanding stuff. He says, if I don't do stuff for him, he always says, I'll bring in a gunboat and then you'll see. That's sort of Hillier's approach to life. And it doesn't get him very far. Anyway, so this is where they are. The Nai Seng incident's kicked off. Hillier is in a flurry of and wants to resolve the situation, but he gets very ill himself. Dysentery, a lot of it about. And he goes to recuperate off in the Gulf of Siam on an American ship. Eventually, he dies too. And so this situation is all hanging up in the air. And there's still this threat of potential war because the king doesn't really know what Hillier has reported back to Bowring and London. He doesn't know. There could be a gunboat on the way. Who knows? Anyway, so communications aren't like, there's no email, right? So that all he could do is think of a way, how can I ameliorate this situation? And what he does is he says, well, one thing I can do to make this situation go away is do something that the British want. And he says, one thing I know the British want is that piece of land on the river. So what he decides to do is, instead of asking the British to buy the land, the king goes and buys the land and gives it to the British government for their first consulate. So that land is a gift. It's a grant. If that land, if the embassy in the 21st century was still on that land, then the original argument about the transaction for commercial purposes being invalid may hold some water. But, of course, it wasn't. That's what the consulate looked like when it was first built in the 1850s. But in 1926, they decided to move to the Plunget site, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is now Central Embassy. And that's where they stayed until very recently, and until they knocked it down to build a department store, right? Now, I'd just like to focus a little bit, going towards the end, I just want to focus a little bit on one of those historic monuments that I mentioned right up front, the statue of Queen Victoria. It was installed in 1905, actually paid for by the British community with a lot of Chinese-British money. So British people or Chinese people with British nationality or British subjects paid for it, and it was put on the Jerungrung Road side of the embassy. So the road would be up here, and on the other side would be the river. And as some of you may know, people used to go there to pray for children and stuff like that because she had a reputation for having a lot of children. When they moved to Plunget, Queen Victoria moved to right in the middle of the site, as you can see there, and she sat facing Plunget Road. And again, people would go there to pray or to make offerings. Now, in 2006, I think it was, the British first decided they needed to sell off some of the land. They sold off the strip at the front, and that was sold to Central Department Store Group, who built Central Embassy. And because of that, this whole stretch of the front went. So Queen Victoria had to go too. So she was moved to the back of the residence, where she sat comfortably until the British sold the rest of the site. And unfortunately, right now, Queen Victoria is sitting on Soi Somkit between a polluted canal and a building site facing the central car park. Now, there are plans for her to be moved back into the site when it's completed, but I don't think she's amused by that location. The embassy, of course, had to move as well. The Chancery moved into an office building on Saturn Road. The ambassador moved into a condominium on the river, this high-rise condominium. I think he's on the 72nd floor or something. Interestingly, he's now on the same river or sitting facing the same direction as the original British consulate in 1856. And in fact, if he walks out onto his balcony and looks to his right, he should be able to make out the NT Telecom Tower, which is sitting now on top of the original British consulate site. And if he then turns around and looks to his left, he might just catch a glimpse of the Protestant cemetery, where he might be able to see the grave of Charles Batten Hillier, that first consul who died rather tragically of dysentery. Thank you very much.
To answer the question, any question, please? Raise your hand.
So you showed a picture of a letter there. Can you say some more of the primary sources you took a look at? Of the primary sources you looked at for the research of the book?
Sure. Yes, the main sources, the two main locations that I looked at. One was in London at the National Archive in Kew, which has an extensive library of correspondence between Siam and and Hong Kong and London from that period. And the other is really here in Bangkok, the National Library. There's a National Library, and then behind the National Library is the National Archive. Interestingly, the National Archive doesn't have anything before Rama V. But in the National Library, there's a rare books room where they keep pre-Rama V original documents. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not in great shape, but they try their best to maintain them. And there's some really fascinating documents there.
Yeah, thank you. That was excellent. What occasioned the move of the embassy in 1926, I believe, to the Planchet side?
Well, from the beginning of the 20th century, the riverside was becoming a less desirable location because you had quite a lot of industry. So the factories, it was dirty. There was actually a lot of how can I put this? Well, yes, there was a brothel right opposite from the embassy, which they didn't like. There was a feeling that this area was going down in value. There was a certain urgency as well because the Treasury had said, we don't mind if you move, but we won't give you any money. Yeah, some things never change, right? So the deal they did to move to Planchet was with the Hillier family. And it was actually a land swap. So they said Hillier got the land on the river, which he immediately flipped to the government for the post office, and Britain and the Brits got the Planchet land. At the time, it was really out of the way.
Good evening. Your talk was very interesting because it focused on not only an incident but how it still influences the property rules of this place. So if you talk about this and the things which we currently see in the newspaper about this country inviting people from other places in a very liberal way, what's your opinion and insight if you compare both of them?
Thank you for that question. I'll now talk for 2 hours about property law. One of the fascinating things for me was to see that in the 1850s, you could get in trouble for being a nominee land owner, just as you can today. And in the 1850s, the authorities, not only were they averse to giving foreign ownership of land to foreigners, which is possibly understandable, they were also averse to the idea of a long leasehold. And today, the maximum leasehold in Thailand is still 30 years. It's one of the shortest in the world. And I wonder how much of that is a legacy of these incidents that happened almost 200 years ago. But, despite that, and I think that's in a way to address the other part of that question, I think Thailand is extremely welcoming up to a certain point, and that point is often to do with land ownership rights. And again, that reflects so much of the Bowring Treaty. Yes, you can bring your British consul in and boss around your own subjects. We don't care. Yes, we can give you trade rights, but no, you can't have the land. And maybe it's a very emotional thing, I think, in Thailand too, to the land ownership question. And it's always been there.
Thank you for your fascinating insight. I wonder if you could say something about some of the other countries who have quite interesting properties on the river, such as the French Consulate and Embassy and the Portuguese building. What is the status of the land on which those properties sit on?
I don't know the answer to that, to be honest, but the Portuguese were the first, it was the first foreign grant in about 1821, and it was granted to the Portuguese so that they could trade, but nothing ever happened, and the Portuguese consul in the end got in big trouble because he was not able to get a salary, so he had to become a trader himself. But they did keep the land, and they've maintained that land throughout. So I understand it. I can't see any reason why it would not be still Portuguese land. The French, I think, are similar. I'm not sure about the French, but I believe it's still French owned. You know, you can own land as a foreign embassy. That is allowed. The British owned the land on Plunget.
Hi, Simon. The guy, what was his name? Paddycombe. Paddycombe. I was just wondering, how did he become such good friends with the king at that time, and was the king friends with other people on such a personal basis?
I think the answer is yes, he was, and I think a lot of it stems from his time in the monastery. He was apart from his monastical studies, he was learning Latin and French and English. He learned English, and the people teaching it were the missionaries. So Palgua, Bradley, these were really friends of his. Paddycombe would come and trade, and you could visit. You might be taken to visit the palace. You might. Every year the king would have a birthday party and invite all the foreigners to come and basically get drunk. So there was a lot more interchange between at that level at that time.
I see. Thank you.
What was the reason for British to sell their embassy? Was it part of the global sale of embassy land, or it was unique situation in Thailand?
Yes to both. It was when the Treasury looked at the list of foreign assets owned by the Foreign Office, the Bangkok embassy was right there at the top. So they were doing similar things elsewhere, but not quite in the same way. In Japan, they also have a beautiful embassy, but there they did a deal with the Japanese government that would allow them to lease back. In Singapore, they sold off bits of their land and kept bits, but it was just financial pressure. In the end, the British government earned £500 million from the sale of this land. And apart from having to build the buildings, they had gone through almost 200 years without having paid a penny for the land. So, financially, it made sense. From other points of view, perhaps not.
Thank you, Simon. I wonder whether you can say a few words about the stark differences between the Bowring Treaty of 1855 and the Paddycombe incident of July 1893, where Siam fared really very badly.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure what kind of comparison you can make. I mean, the French in 1893 basically were negotiating with the Siamese and took military action, sending gunboats up the Chao Phraya in order to force the hand of the Siamese to get control of territory in Indochina. I think one thing I think is interesting is the relationship with, I think at that time, and the relationship between the Siam and Britain was much friendlier than the relationship between Siam and France anyway. And partly because the British didn't look like they wanted to take territory, and the French looked like they wanted to take territory. So the Siamese authorities believed, I think, that the British would stand by them in a struggle with the French if it came to that. And so when they appealed, when the French were threatening and Siam appealed to the British for assistance, there was nothing in the treaty that forced the British to give assistance. But they thought there was an understanding. And the British did nothing. They said, well, not really our problem, thank you. And so I think that changed the perception of that Siam-Britain relationship after 1893. And I think they realized that fundamentally the Western powers are acquisitive.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to give a hand and thank you, Kun Simon, for such a wonderful, wonderful talk and a wonderful book. ขอบคุณค่ะ ขอบคุณค่ะ And now may I invite Kun Taw, the chair of our lecture committee of the Siam Society, to present him with a small gift. ค่ะ เดี๋ยวถ่ายรูปด้วยกัน